This video is brought to you by Squarespace. More about them later in this video. Welcome back to Biographics. I'm your host, Cosmic Horror Madman Eric Malachite, and today we're talking about one of my favorite topics, space travel. Today's script was handled by the ever-factual Larry Holsworth, so why not show him some love down in the comments below, and while you're at it, tell us what your favorite space mission is. Mine has got to be DART, because there are few things humans have done that are more badass than turning an asteroid into a comet by slamming a satellite into it moving at 24,000 kilometers per hour. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union successfully launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite launched into Earth orbit. History records that event as one which generated near panic among the American people and their government. In truth, the US government was not taken by surprise by the Soviet launch. President Eisenhower had been warned 3 weeks before the event that a Soviet launch was imminent, and U-2 overflights and other forms of surveillance had kept the American scientific and political communities well informed of Soviet progress and intentions. Even still, some were dismissive, with one detractor in the administration referring to Sputnik and the rocket that carried it into orbit as nothing more than a useless hunk of iron. Reminder, this thing is partially why you're able to watch episodes of The Simpsons on a rectangle that lives next to your junk right now. Still, it was a shock to the less informed public, one which drew attention to the necessity of American technology surpassing that of its global geopolitical rival. Politicians and propagandists skillfully presented the United States as trailing the Soviets in the newly christened space race. Americans had a long history of supporting the underdog as well as opposing communism, and government efforts coupled with the scientific and engineering communities found growing support for an American effort to achieve dominance in the area of space. In October 1958, just over 1 year after Sputnik 1, President Eisenhower approved America's first program to launch manned vehicles into space. Project Mercury, named, according to NASA's own website, for a Roman god who was very fast, and Karl has an editor's note here. That is literally what the NASA official website says about Project Mercury. Admittedly, it does this on the space race for kids, but he couldn't help but quote it. Mercury was widely celebrated by the American public. The first 7 men to be selected as American astronauts, a word which loosely translates from Greek as star sailor, which is, yes, very badass, were immediate national heroes, even before any of them were launched into space. The first American, Alan Shepard, flew in space in a brief suborbital mission on May 5th, 1961, just over 3 weeks following the Soviets' launch of the first man into space. Thus, the perception in the public mind was that the Americans still trailed the Soviets, and the support of the American program under the auspices of a civilian agency, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, was a patriotic duty. Today's video is brought to you by publicly sourced information from NASA. You know, the Earth's not flat. We checked. It says right there. Bonus fact about Alan Shepard's first historic jaunt to space: as if being sat atop $1 billion of bleeding-edge technology built by the lowest bidder wasn't enough to worry about, Shepard also pissed himself moments before takeoff. In his defense, he'd unexpectedly spent about 8 hours on the launch pad and had heroically held it the entire time, but just before launch he was forced to sheepishly radio back to command and tell them that he really needed to pee. A call that ironically caused a bunch of eggheads at command to nearly crap themselves, as there was a genuine worry that pissing in the suit would cause the life support systems to fail. Since calling off the launch was out of the question this close to liftoff, the decision was made to roll the dice and let Shepard pee directly into the suit, after experts came to the conclusion doing so probably wouldn't kill him. In addition to providing valuable data about the success of spacesuits at dealing with unexpected moisture, Shepard's little accident prompted the space agency to begin building suits with considerations made for stuff like needing to crap oneself. America. Anyway, 3 weeks after Alan Shepard's first flight, President John F. Kennedy addressed a joint session of Congress, riding a wave of patriotic fervor following Shepard's success. Kennedy demanded a greater financial commitment to space exploration, stating,
"I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth."
At the time, the outline for how such a goal could be accomplished was in place at NASA. The basic scheme included a 3-man mission using a separate vehicle to land 2 men on the moon and later return them to the command ship in lunar orbit. Following their rendezvous, the lunar lander would be discarded. The 3 men returned to Earth in the command ship, which would re-enter the atmosphere and return to Earth via parachute to a water landing, to be recovered by the Navy later. The lunar mission envision meant that astronauts would have to maneuver their space vehicles independently as needed, rendezvous with another vehicle, dock with that vehicle, undock, and dock again. They would need to live and work in space for several days, and they would need to work outside of their protective ships, carrying their own breathing air conditioning equipment, and all that was needed to survive and operate in space. Meanwhile, NASA would need to develop new, more efficient and powerful rockets to haul not only that much equipment, but the massive pendulous lead-lined balls required to even consider doing something like that in the first place. The Mercury program accomplished none of those things. Mercury demonstrated men could operate in space, but the astronaut had little control over his spacecraft. Mercury astronauts remained in their spacesuits and helmets throughout their missions, none of which lasted longer than a few hours. This is partly why Shepard's suit had no considerations made for the call of nature. It was clear to NASA engineers and astronauts themselves that another program was necessary, one that bridged Mercury to the lunar program, named Project Apollo. The bridge program would be one in which astronauts learned the procedures required for Apollo. They would rendezvous with other spacecraft, both manned and unmanned. They would learn to dock and undock their spacecraft, walk in space untethered to their vehicle, and remain in space for the extended periods necessary for the trip to the moon. They would learn to fly in space, applying the lessons learned to the future missions to the moon. The new program, designated Project Gemini, would consist of several missions of 2 men in a space capsule designed to accommodate them side by side. It was officially initiated by NASA on December 7th, 1961. Gemini referred to the stars of that constellation containing Castor and Pollux, the heavenly twins. NASA's official pronunciation of the program had the name ending in a long I, to rhyme with I. Popular pronunciation, including among the media and even some of the astronauts themselves, frequently used the long E sound, to rhyme with knee, which more than anything is just very funny. If you want to set your brand up to launch you to the moon, then you're going to need a snazzy website. And the sponsor for today's video, Squarespace, has you covered. Squarespace is the all-in-one website platform, perfect for entrepreneurs with wares to sell, bloggers with a message to spread, and artists looking to reach the masses with their work. Whether you're just starting out or you're looking for a way to better manage your brand, Squarespace makes it easy for you to create beautiful, professional websites, engage with your audience, and make sure the right people are getting your message. Squarespace's Fluid Engine makes it easier than ever for pretty much anyone to dive in and make a beautiful website. Answer a few questions about the goals you'd like to accomplish with your site, choose a template, and get dragging and dropping elements onto your template. Drag and drop technology is included in every Squarespace site. With Squarespace Blueprint and their brand new AI and SEO tools, you'll be able to create a fully personalized website using this guided design system. Choose from a professionally curated list of layout and design options and build a unique presence from the ground up. And with their SEO tools, you'll have all the tools you need to launch yourself to the moon. And best of all, if you're selling stuff on your website, you'll be able to offer a simple yet seamless checkout experience with Squarespace's powerful tools. You'll be able to accept credit cards, PayPal, Apple Pay, and in eligible countries, offer customers the option to buy now and pay later with Afterpay and ClearPay. Ready to get started? Check out squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/biographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Now, back to the video. Project Gemini began with Mercury already conducting manned flights and with Apollo planning gearing up significantly. NASA engineers, planners, scientists, technicians, and support personnel were stretched between the two programs, as well as in support of various non-manned satellite and other space exploration activities of the time. Yet NASA, although a wholly American program in terms of funding and management, was not wholly American in terms of personnel involved. Most infamously, NASA was nudged along with help from a bunch of former Nazi scientists and researchers like Werner von von Braun, who had led the development of the Nazi V-2 program during World War II and was basically given clemency for helping build Nazi super missiles in return for helping America slap its across the Soviets' face during the space race. For anyone who wants to know more, our previous and more cranially smooth host covered this here on Biographics, and it was also written by me. Moving away from Nazi scientists for a moment, another major contributor to Project Gemini were Canadian aviation and aerospace professionals, led by James Arthur Jim Chamberlain. In the 1950s, Chamberlain had led the program by Avro Canada to develop an interceptor aircraft capable of operating at twice the speed of sound, or Mach 2, at altitudes above 50,000 feet, known as the Avro Arrow. Despite showing great promise during flight testing and with favorable evaluations by the United States Air Force and Britain's Royal Air Force in hand, the Arrow program was summarily cancelled by Canadian Prime Minister John Diefenbaker on February 20th, 1959. All plans, tooling, existing airframes, and documentation supporting the program were destroyed. Now, officially, the reasoning behind this decision was to prevent Soviet spies stealing classified information, but in the years since, many claimed that the whole thing was nothing more than a deliberate and calculated move on Diefenbaker's part, since it's known he was not a fan of Avro's president, Crawford Gordon. Whatever the case, an understandably annoyed Chamberlain led an exodus of 25 of Avro's engineers and aviation experts to NASA's Space Task Group's Gemini Engineering Division. The group of Canadians later expanded to 32. Chamberlain became head of the Engineering Division, tasked as chief designer for the new project. It was Chamberlain who proposed the two-man configuration, the Gemini name for the project, and the use of the Titan II missile, an intercontinental ballistic missile deployed by the US Air Force as the launch vehicle. Most of the design of the Gemini spacecraft, its mission parameters, its launch procedures, and its recovery procedures fell to the Canadians. Astronaut Virgil I. Gus Grissom, who had flown the second Mercury mission and who was a former USAF test pilot, worked closely with the engineers, particularly in the design of the interior of the Gemini spacecraft. A former test pilot working hand in hand with aviation professionals ensured the resulting spacecraft was designed with the pilot in mind rather than the ground controllers, computers, and technicians monitoring the flights from mission control. For example, the Gemini capsule was equipped with an artificial horizon, which had been absent in Mercury, as well as in-flight radar. The astronaut could thus function as a pilot rather than simply a passenger taking orders from ground-based controllers. At his hands were a joystick allowing him to control the pilot's trilogy of yaw, pitch, and roll, and manual controllers to allow him to manipulate thrusters to move freely. Previous astronauts in Mercury only had limited control of yaw, pitch, and roll. All of the astronauts who subsequently flew in Gemini found the spacecraft to be very much a pilot's vehicle, responsive and manageable. One problem arose over Grissom's extensive involvement. Grissom, who was one of two astronauts on the first Gemini manned mission, was just 5'6" in height. Consequently, much of the interior was laid out to meet his own needs for reach and comfort, which made the interior decidedly cramped for taller astronauts. After the second Gemini mission, the interior of the capsule required modifications to accommodate subsequent flights. The Canadians also designed Gemini with a feature that made it unique among American manned space vehicles. Rather than equipping the capsule with a rocket-powered emergency escape system to separate the capsule from the booster should an emergency occur at launch, Gemini was equipped with aircraft-style ejection seats. Fortunately, their use was never required during the program. Gemini's intent was to allow astronauts to learn to fly in space. Yet first, they had to learn how to fly in Gemini. Intensive training in ground-based simulators and in aircraft and water tanks provided instruction for the second and third groups of astronauts selected for the US space program. The first manned Gemini mission carried the first of the non-Mercury 7 astronauts into space, John Young. Young was a member of the second group of astronauts and would go on to have a distinguished career with NASA, including a second Gemini flight, a trip around the moon on Apollo 10, 3 days on the moon in Apollo 16, and the first flight of the space shuttle in 1981. He later flew the shuttle a second time in 1983. For his first mission, though, he was under the command of Gus Grissom. Together, they flew the first manned Gemini mission, Gemini 3, a test flight, on March 23, 1965. Grissom followed the tradition established during Mercury of giving his spaceship a nickname. In this case, Molly Brown. It was a wry allusion to the loss of his Mercury capsule, which sank due to a hatch mishap following his 1961 suborbital flight. Molly Brown was a reference to the unsinkable Molly Brown of Titanic fame, then a hit show on Broadway. Apparently, NASA did not see the humor, because no other Gemini mission was allowed to assign a nickname to the vehicles involved, though the tradition returned with the Apollo program. Karl's got some bonus facts for us too. NASA, contrary to what you might expect from a space agency staffed with turbo geniuses and nerd lords, is ridiculously superstitious. Known superstitions of the agency include things like the commander playing blackjack with technicians specifically until they lose, eating peanuts to celebrate a successful launch, and cutting the ties of new launch directors. Astronauts and the Soviet-Russian counterparts similarly have a bunch of traditions, superstitions, like eating steak and eggs before a launch or pissing on the wheels of the bus that takes them to the launch pad. No, I'm not joking. Many of these began with earlier missions and are directly inspired by the actions of pioneers in the space race. The peeing thing, for example, was supposedly started by Yuri Gagarin, who is said to have done exactly that before his historic flight. Astro/cosmonauts take this so seriously that some will bring bottles of pre-prepared pee with them to throw on the bus.
Show's piss jug!
Anyway, an astronaut working independently of his spacecraft was considered an essential step in meeting Kennedy's challenge to visit the moon. In early 1965, the Soviets once again beat the Americans to the punch, completing an extravehicular activity, or EVA, a spacewalk, as it were, and sending dramatic pictures of cosmonaut Alexei Leonov back to Earth. With Gemini 4, American astronaut Edward White became the second man to walk in space, and the first American completing NASA's first extravehicular activity, which I will call an EVA from now on because it's just easier. Everyone knows what an EVA is now, right? From that point onward, NASA moved ahead of the Soviets in the quest to reach the moon. As it did so, the popularity of the space program grew with each mission. But before moving on, we really can't ignore the story of how Leonov and his sheer testicular fortitude was legendary, even among the already cast iron-balled ranks of his peers. Something we say because during his 12-minute EVA, his suit inflated due to the pressure differential preventing him from re-entering his capsule. Something he solved by willingly letting air out of his suit in space, all while he couldn't see due to the amount of his own sweat floating around in his helmet. Meaning Leonov, if not for his own quick thinking, very well could have set another record for being the first man to drown in outer space. Or wouldn't it be suffocation? I guess, I'm not sure. Back to America now, and Gemini 5, which in August 1965 set a new record for endurance in space, with astronauts Gordon Cooper, a Mercury veteran, and Charles Pete Conrad Jr. remaining in orbit for 7 days, 22 hours, and 55 minutes. The mission, which was cut 1 day short due to hurricane conditions approaching the recovery area, gave the Americans the record for the longest spaceflight, again surpassing a record set previously by the Soviets. It also established that the astronauts could remain alert and efficient over the length of time required for a mission to the moon. Curiously, Gemini 7 was launched before Gemini 6, subsequently designated Gemini 6A. Gemini 7 set another record for endurance, with James Lovell and Frank Borman remaining in orbit for just under 14 days. During their mission, the two astronauts evaluated a new, lighter-weight spacesuit, established practices for stowage of waste, read crap, tested new foods and beverages being created by NASA contractors, and awaited the arrival of Gemini 6A. When the latter occurred, it marked the first rendezvous by manned space vehicles in orbit. The two capsules met, flew around each other, flew alongside each other on station, and demonstrated that not only could the Americans fly in space, but they could accomplish precision maneuvers in flight. Next came docking with another space vehicle. Gemini 8, with a crew of Neil Armstrong and David Scott, rendezvoused and successfully docked with an Agena unmanned space vehicle designed for the purpose in March 1966. At first successful, the docking soon degenerated into a near disaster when a malfunctioning thruster caused the docked vessels to tumble uncontrollably. Armstrong, believing the problem to be with the Agena, quickly undocked only to find the motion worsening. With both astronauts nearing the point of blacking out, Armstrong managed to regain control by shutting down a series of thrusters on the Gemini. The capsule then moved to re-enter the atmosphere. By the way, did you know space is dangerous? The astronauts' troubles were not yet over. Gemini 8 made a water landing in the Pacific, miles away from the nearest support ships. Naval assistance via parachute rescue arrived shortly after splashdown, but astronauts and rescuers were forced to endure a wait of over 3 hours in choppy waters. All were seasick, which led to dehydration. Eventually, they were recovered by the USS Leonard F. Mason, a veteran Gearing-class destroyer used in the Pacific War. The astronauts, once rested and nourished, reported no serious injuries or ailments. The original crew for Gemini 9 were astronauts Elliot C. and Charles Bassett. Neither had flown in space before, and both were killed in a plane crash near St. Louis Lambert Field on February 28, 1966. These were the very first astronaut fatalities of the US space program. Their backup crew, James Stafford and Eugene Cernan, flew the Gemini mission, redesignated Gemini 9A, in June 1966. The mission was a troubled one. A vehicle that they were supposed to rendezvous and dock with proved unusable due to errors made by contractors while it was being prepared for launch. A scheduled EVA by Cernan also proved problematic up to the point that for a while it appeared the astronaut would not be able to return to the capsule. The main issue is one we've already mentioned, pressure differentials, with Cernan later reporting that the instant the capsule was opened, he was basically rendered wholly immobile by his own pressure suit, noting that in it he had all the flexibility of a rusty suit of armor. The problems didn't stop there though, because this understandably caused Cernan to panic a little, and just like with the aforementioned Alexei Leonov, he began to sweat. A lot. So much so that his visor totally fogged over, with the only visibility Cernan had being a quarter-sized patch of his visor he wiped away the sweat from with the very tip of his nose. Now, just for a moment, imagine being stuck in space, almost blind and unable to move. Cernan was stuck like this for 2 hours. The entire time hearing the various things designed to keep him alive creaking and ripping apart as he struggled against them, to the point some seams on the suit's insulation layers surrounding the long-ass cable supplying him with oxygen failed. Stafford later reported that he had intended to begin re-entry with the Gemini door remaining open and Cernan still tethered to the vehicle outside. Such an action would have incinerated both astronauts, but in Stafford's view, it was a better option than abandoning his comrade to space. In the end, such heroism was unnecessary as Cernan was able to inch his way back into the cockpit, fighting his suit the whole time, and close the capsule door. What a badass. Though Cernan was still singed slightly, the rips and damage to his suit were such that solar radiation was able to penetrate his skin and give him a sunburn. Cernan was also severely dehydrated by the ordeal, losing several pounds of body weight through sweating, something Stafford tried to alleviate by immediately spraying him with water the moment he was able to take off his helmet. Despite this ordeal, astronauts would return to space during Apollo, and Gene Cernan remains, as of 2024, the last human being to walk on the moon, so there's that. One of his last actions on the lunar surface being to write his own daughter's name into the dust with his finger. Aww. Moving swiftly on, Gemini 10 launched into space in the summer of 1966, intent upon rendezvousing with two separate vehicles. The first was an Agena launched for the purpose just days before. The second was a meeting with the Agena abandoned by Gemini 8, which had since drifted, having lost electrical power. The ambitious mission was a complete success, including 2 EVAs by astronaut Michael Collins, and proved again the relative ease by which the Americans could maneuver their spaceships in Earth orbit. NASA was truly flying in space, with the astronaut/pilot an integral part of the process. For example, when Gemini 10 approached the dead Agena from Gemini 8, it was done entirely through visual inputs from the pilot. Planning for Apollo included the necessity of the astronauts departing the lunar surface, rendezvousing with the Apollo command module via direct ascent. That is, they must meet on the first orbit after leaving the lunar surface. As of September 1966, a direct ascent rendezvous had yet to be achieved. Gemini 11, however, accomplished that task, docking with an Agena vehicle. After docking, the Gemini crew fired the Agena's main engine and reached an orbital altitude of 739 nautical miles, over 1,300 kilometers. It remains the highest altitude achieved during crewed orbit as of 2024. In November 1966, Gemini was the last mission of the Gemini program. It included 3 separate EVAs conducted by astronaut Edwin Buzz Aldrin, which finally demonstrated that astronauts could work effectively outside their spacecraft for extended periods. The modifications and improvements to the spacesuits worn by astronauts throughout the Gemini program finally proved their worth. With the completion of Gemini 12, NASA had met or exceeded the goals of the entire program. The astronauts had successfully demonstrated the ability to fly in space, rendezvous and dock with other vehicles, work effectively outside their spacecraft, and respond to emergencies in space safely and with minimal damage. NASA was finally ready to move forward with Project Apollo and a trip to the moon. Spaceflight, the astronauts, and growing American success led to NASA becoming a symbol of American technological achievement in the mid-1960s. Space themes permeated American culture. The astronauts themselves became celebrities and were welcome guests on television, on both entertainment and information programs. The Gemini missions came in rapid success, 6 in 1965 alone, and their presence dominated the airwaves. Space foods, marketed for public consumption and based on some of the foods consumed by the astronauts during their missions, appeared on store shelves. Although publicly the astronauts were complimentary toward the food NASA provided, privately they were less pleased. This information was not provided to the public. One example of astronaut food offered for public consumption was Space Food Sticks by Pillsbury, a precursor of energy bars. Toys featuring space exploration, plastic modeling kits, comics and coloring books, toy helmets, toy spacesuits, mission control mock-ups, some elaborate and some less so, all became popular toys. At the time, there were only 3 major American television networks, CBS, NBC, and ABC, and all 3 championed NASA's manned programs, covering the launches, breaking into scheduled broadcasts to air significant events during the missions, and providing extensive coverage of the recovery of the astronauts on mission completion. Television coverage was usually centered on the Mission Control Center in Houston, Texas. Launch coverage alternated between Houston and Cape Canaveral, then known as Cape Kennedy in honor of the late president. The news coverage drew strong ratings for all 3 networks, and cutting-edge graphics and animations, for 1965 anyway, were a feature of their programming. Gemini missions were a part of entertainment television as well. In September 1965, NBC debuted a new situation comedy starring Barbara Eden and Larry Hagman titled I Dream of Jeannie. The program featured a genie named Jeannie found trapped in a bottle after astronaut Tony Nelson's one-man space capsule landed near an island, miles distant from his planned recovery area. Over the course of the series run, Gemini launches and images of Gemini missions being prepared on the launch pad were featured in numerous episodes. Eventually, the program was retconned, with another astronaut character, Roger Healy, described as having accompanied Tony during the mission that ended with Jeannie being discovered. The retconning implied Tony and Roger had been on a Gemini mission, one of many launched in 1965. The Gemini missions took place in 1965 and 1966, a period where the United States began to feel the significant tremors that affected society for the rest of the decade. In 1965, when Gemini began flights, few Americans had ever heard of faraway places such as Da Nang, Saigon, and Hanoi. By the end of 1966, the war in Vietnam was dominating nightly newscasts in the United States, with rising body counts leading to questions over America's role in Southeast Asia. Americans began to distrust their government. At home, civil rights demonstrations and protests and major urban riots led many to question the role of state and municipal governments in the United States. Then, in January 1967, a tragic fire in the Apollo 1 space capsule killed 3 astronauts, including Gemini veterans Gus Grissom and Ed White, along with Roger Chaffee. The tragedy seriously compromised public confidence in the space program, largely undoing much of the goodwill which Gemini's success had brought it. The space program obviously did recover, and Apollo finally landed Gemini veterans Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon in July 1969. Orbiting the moon above them was another Gemini veteran, Michael Collins. Following the Apollo missions, the United States conducted the Skylab program and developed the space shuttle. Gemini veterans took part in the Skylab program, including several who served in the 3 onboard missions in the 1970s. Gemini astronaut John Young, who flew on the first manned Gemini mission with Gus Grissom on board Molly Brown, later flew as command pilot for the first manned space shuttle mission. Use of Gemini components, including the space capsule, was considered by both NASA and the US Air Force following completion of the program in 1966. The proven reliability and the praise it had earned from the astronaut pilots led NASA to consider a modified Gemini capsule with supporting additional equipment, being used to shuttle astronauts to the proposed space stations under consideration in the 1960s and 1970s. Eventually, NASA found the plans unworkable. The USAF considered Gemini for several potential military applications, but they balked when it became evident that Gemini capsules required naval intervention to be recovered after flight, and that there was no way around that contingency. Rather than share development with the US Navy, the USAF dropped its interest. In 1967, the latest installment in the James Bond film series You Only Live Twice was released. Its pilot included the seizure of an American space capsule, Jupiter 16, by nefarious evildoers. The spacecraft depicted was a Gemini, easily recognizable by Western audiences after its 2 years of successful operation, faithfully depicted by television around the world. The 1968 film Countdown, starring James Caan, also featured a Gemini capsule, modified to carry a single astronaut. All of the Gemini capsules that successfully completed manned missions are displayed in locations across the United States. In addition, numerous mock-ups and trainers are displayed, some in somewhat unusual locations, including in private homes and an early mock-up designed to use a paraglider on display in the Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh. The Gemini program, brief as it was, remains one of the most unqualified successes of the relatively young science of space travel. There is little doubt that had Gemini not taken place, America would still have gone to the moon. Yet Gemini carried American astronauts into space in pairs, earning the approbation of the public and the praise of the astronauts themselves. They flew in a vehicle that allowed them to learn how to fly in space, how to achieve formation with other vehicles, and how to work outside their spaceships. Gemini was but one of many thousands of steps that ultimately led to Neil Armstrong's one small step, yet it was a crucial one. I hope you learned something today, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to deploy your likes and comment your favorite astronaut. And last but not least, be sure to share this video with someone who loves learning about astronauts, scientists, Wild West cowboys, and so many World War II heroes and villains. I'm Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.